Welcome to the Women in Vinyl podcast with Jen DiEugenio, founder of Women in Vinyl, and contributor Robin Raymond. This podcast facilitates conversations with those working in the vinyl record industry to educate, demystify, and diversify the vinyl community.
Thank you for listening to the Women in Vinyl podcast. We are picking back up here with part 2 of our tech talk on plating with Jett Galindo, Women in Vinyl board member and mastering engineer at the bakery in LA. We hope you enjoyed part 1. If you haven't already listened, you may want to go back and start there, since this will jump right back in. Enjoy!
So how music is essentially cut onto the vinyl format. So the mono center information on your mix gets cut as a lateral movement by your cutting stylus. The stereo is vertical, the vertical movement of your cutting stylus. So when you're talking about your cutting stylus being vertical, it goes up and down, up and down. So if there is some out of phase effects on your mix, that's going to end up causing some severe groove lifts, which is going to be a reject when you're cutting vinyl masters. Whether it's cutting lacquer masters or lathe cuts, those low end out of phase is going to cause potential groove lifts. And by groove lift, I mean the cutting stylus is going to go up so high that the groove is going to be so thin. If the groove is less than 1 mil, it's going to be a reject and it's going to cause the stylus to skip on your turntable.
Also depending on how heavy your tone arm is weighted as well.
Yes,
if you don't have a weighted tone arm, that's going to kick out
yeah,
so quick. Doesn't matter what kind of any record you have. If you've got a phase problem like that, it's good night, Irene.
Yeah,
there's
so
nothing we can do.
yeah, you guys have to do a tech talk of just how to set up your turntable, but
Totally.
yeah, anyway, I digress.
Oh yeah, no, we're not even gonna just talk about it. We're gonna make a video show and or tell.
Yeah,
but mostly show.
So anyway, going back to these low end stereo imaging, how vinyl cutters take care of this phenomenon on the vinyl stage is 2 ways. The most transparent way of controlling that low end phase effects and thinning grooves is to apply a high pass filter.
Yep.
And sometimes a filter is all you need. 20 hertz, 30 hertz high pass filters already going to control that excessive vertical movement in your cutting stylus. Sometimes it's not enough. And at that case, that's when your vinyl cutter uses a low frequency crossover, where the low end information gets turned into mono. And it's surprising because a lot of cutting facilities tend to overdo the low frequency crossover. So another term for that is EE or blend. So many different facilities use different terms. But yeah, it's essentially low frequency crossover and making your low end mono. Like 60 hertz mono all the way down below 60 hertz is going to be a lot already. But I know of cutting facilities that have their low frequency crossover all the way up to 200 hertz. Even higher.
Oh wow.
And that's at that point you as the musician needs to realize that your music's just gonna be gone. It's gonna sound different and your music's gonna be compromised. So keep that in mind when you know that your music's gonna go on vinyl. At the end of the day, you also don't want to mono your mixed productions just because this is gonna help my vinyl cutter. So don't let those things limit your creative process if you're a producer. But at the same time, if there's unnecessary out of phase effects that happen in the low end, just keep that to a minimum. But don't excessively mono your low end just because you think it's going to make the vinyl cutting better. At the end of the day, talk to your vinyl cutter. That's what basically the main advice that I give to any artist wanting to release their music on vinyl. It's better to communicate with the people involved in the production process as opposed to a broker.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys have discussed that yet, but in the vinyl business, sometimes you don't realize that you as an indie musician might be talking to a broker as opposed to the people that are part of the production process. There's some good and bad things to that. Like the advantage is you don't have to worry about anything. It's like the broker's going to do everything for you. But at the end of the day, a lot of cutting corners can happen. And the middleman pretty much takes a lot of that funding.
Jett, can you expand on what a high pass filter means and what the frequencies you were talking about for the lay people that might be enjoying our in-depth? Did you see what I did there? Cutting talk today. Can you tell us about what crossovers mean and what a high pass and maybe what a low pass filter is?
Yeah. So high pass filter is just a type of EQ, equalizing, that is applied at the mastering stage to just control that excessive buildup in the low end. So when you're talking about high pass filter, it's basically an EQ that filters out or attenuates that energy in the low frequency. If you're talking about 6 dB per octave, attenuation around 20 hertz. So it's basically a curve that takes out all the information beyond. Yeah, the stuff you don't want, so you attenuate that. For the low pass filter, it's actually on the top end.
Yeah,
so it's
that
like you're
confused me
passing the low frequency
forever at the
very
beginning, and I was
confusing, right?
like, I want a low pass filter for the top end and a high
it's
pass filter
confusing.
for the bottom. What? I
Yeah,
was
that's reality, people.
I mean, it's like those kind of curveballs that honestly, like I feel 100% certain saying those are some of the things that block people from trying to go any farther and trying to help themselves in that, because
It's confusing.
absolutely. And if you don't have a background in it, it's hard to like force your way through. And being one of the people that did that, I was like bamboozled for a long time.
Yeah, like high pass, in a way, what's helped me is when you're using a high pass filter, you're passing the highs.
Yeah, you're letting all the high stuff go.
Yeah,
You're
including the 50 hertz is considered part of the high. Yeah,
pass by high. And now
So-
we're letting the low stuff go by. It's fine.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
exactly. Going back to controlling the buildup on the low frequencies and taming the excessive vertical movement of your cutting stylus that causes your grooves to really thin out, just applying a high pass filter can help sometimes. But if it's too much, a vinyl cutter can even use a low frequency crossover. So when we're talking about crossover, it's a certain point in the frequency spectrum where you set a frequency point where a certain adjustment happens beyond that crossover point. So when we're talking about like low frequency crossover, at around, let's say, 100 hertz crossover for low frequency, beyond the 100 hertz and below, that's when the whole mono effect happens. So depending on the outboard processor that the vinyl cutter uses or a plugin, the severity of the mono effect can be adjusted. So let's say for like an electronic Skrillex production, you will need like an excessive LFX low frequency crossover at around 200 hertz or something. It really depends. But also it depends on the vinyl cutter's cutting lathe. Yeah, and the style too. Certain cutting lathes can handle all these anomalies better. So it really depends on the cutting lathe and the vinyl cutter. So as much as you can, avoid doing all those processing for unnecessary reasons, except for the fact that you think it's going to improve your vinyl cutting. If at the end of the day you're doing processing that's not in the service of the music at the end of the day, you'd much rather leave that to the experts. So communicate with the pressing plant, and if it's possible for you to be able to connect with the actual vinyl cutter, that would be great.
And
so
maybe, Jett, you could talk about why something may be cut at 33 versus 45 and the sort of space that allows.
So 45 RPM, a lot of audiophile records are cut at 45 RPM just because essentially they do offer like a higher fidelity quality in terms of listening to music, just because essentially on 45 RPM, there's a lot more real estate for music to get tracked. There's so much more groove space for musical content to be cut into. So there's a lot more clarity and detail that you get to experience when you're listening to 45 RPM music. One of the few caveats of 45 RPM though, as opposed to 33, is because 45 RPM records take up so much more space for your music, you don't get to put as much amount of music on a 45 as opposed to 33. So for example, for a 12-inch 33 RPM record, you can cut about 20 to 23, 25 minutes of music. 25 is pushing it. Like
pushing
I
it,
won't
yeah.
recommend. Yeah, exactly. For us ladies here, we freak out when someone gives 25 minutes. But ideally 18 to 20 minutes for 33 RPM. When it's 45 RPM, you're thinking about less than 15 minutes of
Oh yeah.
music per side. It's different for lathe cuts, right,
I mean,
Robin?
no, not really.
It's the
Really
same.
not. I mean, 25 is even pushing it for me at 33, just like based on where I actually have to put my stylus down to start cutting to avoid
Yeah.
like wow and flutter. And just as a little
Reminder.
note, a little reminder, yeah, wow and flutter we addressed on our vinyl 101.1.
Cool.
So you can go back and treat yourself to that if you'd like. But yeah, just because my records don't adhere to the RIAA curve, again, something we talked about in vinyl
Oh, yeah, that
101.1,
too.
it's my records are a little bit different. So I mean, I've been able to get 25 and a half and like 26 on a 33 without a label.
And so,
Because labels take up space, people.
well,
They take up space.
and we
So.
were going to talk about lacquer versus DMM, and so that could be a good sort of lead in there as
Oh, see what you did there? I'm not the only pun queen, you guys. I'm not the only one. Not, but I will call attention to it every time. Yes, I will.
But maybe, I mean, one of the really interesting things that Jett and I did when I visited was we played a record
man.
that was cut to DMM versus cut to lacquer,
Totally.
and played it in the studio. And I think it was so interesting, and I wish we could play that record for everybody.
I know.
But
I will ask permission. It's going to be difficult reaching out to record labels for this one because it's a pretty big artist.
yeah, that was a pretty big one. But maybe you could
yeah.
talk about that.
I'm speaking in the perspective of an actual lacquer cutter as opposed to DMM. So, I mean, at that point, you'll also have to realize that I am pro lacquer cutting.
We
as
all are
opposed to
here.
DMM. Yeah. But yeah, just to give you guys a quick background on what me and Jen did. So there was a project that due to time constraints, while we were doing our test cuts with the lacquer master, the label decided that just in case it won't make it on time, that they're going to have DMM cutting for the record as well. So we ended up with this very rare opportunity where we have both test pressings for the lacquer master and the other test pressing where it started with a DMM. And it's just a very eye-opening A/B listening comparison. So we just made sure that when we were recording the test pressings for both the lacquer master and the DMM, that everything is consistent. Like the only variable here is whether we're listening to the lacquer or the DMM. And the lacquer just had so much more depth and low end information as opposed to DMM just having a harshness to it. So that's where my opinion lies. The thing with DMM is for its direct metal mastering. I believe that's what it stands for, correct?
Yeah, you got it.
But it's actually your music. It's technically bypassing the first stage, which is cutting into your lacquer acetate masters and just cutting directly into the metal.
Yeah, copper plate.
And yeah, in a copper plate. And that alone, just the fact that the music is cut from different masters, it already lends itself to a different sound.
Yeah, there's no give.
Yeah,
There's no gift,
I'm just much sonically. There's a reason why lacquer acetates have been around and is considered the standard. DMM is a newer technology. Well, not necessarily newer because it's been around for like 20 decades. I can't fully recall the accurate numbers, but
I think DMM got started in the 70s, and then it got
really?
really, really, really popular in the 80s, especially in Germania with like Kraftwerk and all of the electronic new wave, that kind of sound.
Maybe it is program dependent too.
And
maybe
that
DMM might be program.
And that was one of the things, and that's I feel like why the Krauts really, I mean, they're responsible for the VMS 70, like the lacquer cutting lathe as well. So I mean, all hail the fatherland. But
1970s.
Yeah, I know that they did find a lot of success in that kind of new wave music because there was more of that high end, like
it's very interesting.
Kind of frequency.
So just know that if you're as the musician consumer, your music's gonna respond differently whether it's DMM masters or lacquer masters. For our listening comparison at that time, me and Jen, we listened to a rock album and rock just sang on lacquer masters.
Yeah, it was a really cool comparison. And what are some things, I'm sure people who are listening to this are probably nerdy enough that they've seen the grooves under a microscope, and you guys look at those all the time. So what are some things, like people may have heard the term kissing grooves? What are some of those things that you run into when you're cutting?
Well, kissing grooves is definitely one of them. And when you're talking about kissing grooves, it's when the grooves
It's not as romantic as it sounds.
yeah, but it literally
really not.
kisses
Yeah.
on the scope. Just when it's lightly touching, it's fine. It's not gonna be a reject. But if it very much, I'm not sure if this is like supposed to be PG, but Doug always said, if your grooves fornicate, then that's a reject. So
I mean,
yeah.
it's the consent rule right there. You know, light touching is fine. Once one groove overtakes the other one, it's a reject. I'm
It's a
sorry,
reject.
You're not
Consent
allowed.
is-
Consent rule.
So that's one of the terminologies you would hear when talking about vinyl. I know I listed a couple of things here, and I'm sure there's more. But the whole talk about lead in and lockout grooves. The lead in is the space on your record where the actual grooves start. So the very outermost part of your vinyl disc, the lead in is where the grooves come in, and it takes about a few seconds before the actual music starts. So that's the lead in. And the lockout groove is when your music is finally done, and then the groove just keeps on cutting for a couple more seconds, and then until the very end, it very much closes the groove by locking itself and ending the groove to where it meets with a previously cut groove all the way inside the disc. I hope I
The only time
explained it.
overlapping is okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah,
But
that's the only time when,
Yeah.
when grooves can
Only
overlap. But you also want to make sure that, well, vinyl cutters already have it set to their cutting lathes, but the lockout grooves have to be like not directly under the label, you know? Because if it is, it's
hard.
gonna ruin your stylus. And I'm not sure if you'd have to worry about that with lathe cuts since you have more control over it, Robin.
I mean, the way that my cutter head is oriented, the driver, like the actual speaker driver, will run into the chuck if I'm like not on it. So I
That's
have to
cool.
make sure that I'm like, oh, it's time. There's some times where I'm in like a mega squat, like waiting to the
Oh,
last
damn.
second so I can lift that head up. But
Your vinyl cutter will need to make sure that your record has lockout grooves, or else your turntable will just go crazy in terms of where the tone arm is going to settle once your record is done playing.
yeah, I'll just run
So-
into the label and you'll get a
Yeah.
wake-up call. Hey, Jett, I was just going to say, kissing grooves, I mean, we pass them most of the time. And like when we see them on test cuts and stuff, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but they just sound like a little subtle distortion sometimes. It's not always. And like, I mean, that's kind of like the pass fail right there. Like if you're
True.
getting an egregious sound, then that smooch is just too much. And you're like, okay, bye. This is a recut.
Consent.
But so sometimes you can hear kissing grooves and sometimes you can't. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
we like to walk that line. For
Now,
sure.
we did talk about a little bit catalog numbers and scribe
Yeah.
numbers on Vinyl 101, but you guys are actually putting that in when you're cutting.
I do enjoy that part. So
You have a
whether
stamp
it's there-
too, don't you?
Is there
Yeah, we
pressure,
do.
like handwriting?
So
yeah.
it's so funny because
Spelling.
but yeah,
Dude.
Oh
I'm
my
sure,
God.
I'm sure you guys covered the scribe number, catalog number
Yeah.
on the previous episodes, because you'd be surprised by how many times a client doesn't have a scribe number ready when they're ordering
Oh,
their
yeah.
their vinyl. And sometimes like they can't even decide that we have to leave our lacquer master without any scribe number, and sometimes we ask the plating facility to scribe it for us because they haven't decided. It's a string of alphanumeric characters that makes your masters unique throughout the production process. So that's a very crucial when you decide to release your music on vinyl. But besides the scribe number that we etch onto the actual disc, there are times when the client is feeling fancy
Mhm.
and they want like an entire phrase or a logo to be on there. So when we cut the NERD Lemonade album, it's an entire phrase that we
No.
cut.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's
Pharrell,
fun.
you're a monster.
I know. We only allow a certain number of characters.
No kidding. I mean, and that is again where lacquer and DMM has a huge advantage over being a lathe cutter because man,
Oh man, yeah, that's got to be hard for you.
I
Do you
like.
have like a heated scribe? Like
Oh, I
to
have it like
etch?
no, it's a little like metal kind of pen thing that
We use
Kevin
kind of
so
that too.
benevolently gave it. Yeah, I think it's like a legit scribe thing that he gave me as like a my lightsaber.
That's rough. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
I have like 50
for those,
copies of like a huge sentence. I'm like,
yeah,
"Oh my
Oh my
God."
God.
And
Yeah.
yeah. I'm like,
yeah. For
there's
those who
something.
don't, for those who aren't familiar, the lathe cuts, the actual material is the vinyl material itself, so it's a harder material. The acetate we start off on a vinyl cutting facility is a much more malleable material, and it's easier for us to cut the scribe numbers and a phrase and a
Mhm.
logo. Yeah, and we also have a stamp
Yeah, a little
in our
bakery stamp.
studio where our bakery logo is stamped onto the disc too. So that's fun. But it took practice for us to figure out how to make sure that we can cut without ruining the grooves.
Yeah.
So yeah, that took some practice, but we figured it out.
Did you I haven't ever seen a JG on a record. Like I've seen a bakery stamp on a record. Maybe I just haven't seen any of your handiwork, but
So it really depends, but there are times when we don't put our initials on the actual vinyl masters.
why,
I prefer
buddy?
putting it, but it really depends. It's something that we all agreed upon as a team of four in the studio. So there's four
Really?
of us, three mastering engineers. And if it's like a big label where all of us are involved, it's like we just keep it as the bakery. There are times where it's my personal client and they prefer that my initial is there. So a
Hell
lot
yeah. I
yeah,
mean,
it's like
cutting is a totally,
it is.
I mean, that's such an integral and such a personal relationship with that record. But as like a cutting person who collects records, like I love to be able to celebrate my fellow cutting people. And I mean, like, I love the bakery for sure. And I know that you probably had a hand in something, but I mean, I would love to collect the entire set of Jett Galindo mastered and cut records because I'm a fan. Love your work, you know? But like, same with Levi. Like, Levi messaged me and he was like, oh, dude, you got to get this record that I just did. It's
I guess
amazing.
I
And I'm
guess
like,
it's
okay,
different
no
for
problem. Send me the link. I'll buy it
because
yesterday.
I know that with black belt it's Levi, unless there are other mastering engineers.
No, it's just him.
Like for bigger facilities like Metropolis,
Lab PG, Sterling.
Sterling,
I mean, even
and
Sterling, but like Nino puts,
it really varies. It really
yeah,
depends on engineer to engineer. Like Eric Boulanger, who's our head engineer,
yeah.
he puts a V instead of like
Oh yeah.
EB.
I mean,
Um,
it's such sorcery. Like
yeah, like at the
Kevin's
end of
got a
the
little
day,
KP that you can like barely see. I
and
think it's
there
only because I've
are
Well,
seen it
it's
so many
fun
times.
too, like on Discogs when I'm looking at all of my unofficial Black Sabbaths and tracking down where all
Yeah.
of these came from in different countries.
Totally.
You can tell by that scribe too, like who
Yeah.
cut it, where they got their plates from, or whatever. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and
so,
like as somebody that just makes plastic records, like seeing mine on Discogs is pretty crazy too.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, guess
What did
who
someone
made that?
call it? A heavy slab?
Oh, heavy slab of vinyl. That was wicked. I
yeah.
mean, oh man. That was the best part. It was just like, this is a heavy slab of vinyl. And then if it says some surface noise, but sounds great overall. And I was like, it's a lathe cut, bro.
That-
But like, it's
It's
also
a
a
lathe
record.
cut.
That should be the
Again,
next
so-
T-shirt.
it's-
Hashtag heavy slab.
Oh yeah. Again, in the Robin Raymond offside women in vinyl line of t-shirts that have
There
awkward
should be
sayings
an
on
Easter
them.
egg on the Women in Vinyl website
Oh,
where they just
man.
click on that and it takes them
Heavy
to an
slabs.
Italian news story. Yeah.
That's great.
But yeah,
But-
like there are some records like La La Land, Star Trek where my initials are there. It's
Okay,
like
good.
it's just
Because those are
it,
two
it
on my
really
list.
varies. Like sometimes it's PhD with Peter Hewitt Dutton, our other mastering engineer here. It
Yeah.
really varies, but the thing that's mostly there is going to be the bakery logo.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's rad. I mean, like family first for sure. But I have a just like a short technical question because you did drop a little hint towards the half speed master.
Mm.
So because we kind of talked about I cut in real time at real speed, can you talk about half speed mastering? I mean, I know that there's going to be a bunch of people that have records that say half speed masters done at Abbey Road. Can you talk about half speed master and like
Sure.
why it's awesome or why it's
So-
inappropriate for something?
So it's funny because there was one, I forgot which project it was, that just triggered us the decision to just cut everything half speed moving forward.
Mhm.
It was definitely a sacrifice on our end to make that decision because you make more money by spending less time cutting, you know? But we've just decided it was just a very much night and day difference with cutting half speed versus like normal speed on our lathe.
Right.
There's many variables that are involved, but specifically for our setup, the half speed just sings. And one of the main things that really helped half speed sound amazing on our setup is when you're remember the whole RIA curve with cutting. So the whole, I'm not sure if you guys have discussed RIA curve before. It looks like
Briefly.
you guys have.
Yeah.
So when cutting lacquer masters, the lathe already has an RIA curve on it, which means the low end is significantly brought down with the highs really boosted up. But that's essentially how a lot more music gets cut into a vinyl disc.
Right.
And pretty much all turntables will have the reverse RIA curve just so the music plays back flat. The one thing about half speed cutting is when you're cutting at half speed, there's less stress on cutting the highs on the
Okay.
music. So with that in mind, there's less stress on the actual cutting stylus to cutting all that high frequency information.
Right.
And with that, we're able to just add some more amplitude, just level overall, and just make it a more powerful sounding record
Right.
when you're cutting at half speed. What some people are saying that when you're cutting at half speed, you compromise the low end just a bit just because you're cutting at half the octave. So you're pretty much losing all that like 20 hertz and below.
I mean, something's got to
for-
give in a physical format.
Exactly,
Like you
yeah.
can't have everything. It's not a buffet.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. For our case, the half speed, just the whole advantages of half speed outweighed the regular cutting for us. I mean, a lot of egos on the bakery too. So it's like, fuck it, we're gonna make less money because we
We're gonna
sound so
make
much
better
better
records.
that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole record business right there.
But
we don't care
there
about money.
are-
Let's just make it sound cool.
There are rare cases where and also that's the reason why our studio is just a bit pricier compared to like other facilities. But at the end of the day, it's like whether it's an independent artist or not, I try to like lead them to the right direction in terms of like vinyl, even though we don't end up cutting many times just because it's expensive as fuck for indie artists. But we were willing to just go half speed for that reason because it sounds amazing. But there are cases where we cut regular speed, and there was one time that we had to cut one-offs. So it's not like lathe cuts, but
okay.
it's like one-off. So just 20 discs in general for
What?
the
That's bonkers.
yeah, it's like basketball players. It's not the Lakers, but the LA
But the other
Nets.
guys? The LeBrons? Is it the LeBrons?
I know. The management wanted to gift like the basketball players vinyl records
But
of an
lacquers.
unreleased music on vinyl, so they decided let's do lacquers. It's very different from one-offs, right? It's different from lathe cuts. Like if you're going to go that route, just go for lathe cuts as opposed to like lacquer.
Yeah, we've had
discs.
people
That's the
people
most
reach out to
excessive
ask
thing.
for
One-offs.
short runs of like
Short runs.
for the like season ticket holders to get like the I don't do sports, but like the
I don't sport.
but like whatever songs and like hype stuff they do and have.
Oh,
yeah, they
man.
wanted to like cut that kind of stuff.
Give me that all day. Refer them to me. I will do it.
Dude,
I do.
Robin, there's gotta be like a way to connect with somehow. I guess the sports likes those one-offs, huh?
Oh, dude, I get
Send us
so many.
sports to Robin.
Yes, I used to work for the
You're
Olympic
such a
team. This
nerd.
should be built in. Come on, I sport. Come on. I mean, there's a whole bunch of like licensing things there. So, I mean, I
True.
don't generally do anything like that. Be forewarned, everyone. But just one other question, kind of, Jett. How much analog outboard gear do you have? Like, do you prefer working in an analog outboard chain, or do you do everything like in the box and in a digital like plug-in stream? Does that make your workflow easier for cutting? Do you like an analog tube kind of feel?
You should
on
probably
some-
So-
explain what that is too.
yeah, explain it.
So for many of our readers, you guys
Readers.
know at this point what analog readers.
They're not reading.
Listeners.
This is opposite of reading.
Oh God, sorry. So for us podcast listeners,
There you go.
you guys are probably know already what analog versus digital is. So back when we were at the mastering lab, we can cut directly from tape machine to the cutting lathe,
That's my
and
dream.
that was Yeah,
That's
that
my
was
dream.
amazing because it's harder in a way because you have to make sure that you time like you already know when the next song is going to come
Yeah.
when it passes through the tape.
Oh yeah.
It's like everything is so much more manual, and
Yeah.
you cannot leave the cutting session when you're
Yeah,
cutting
I
on
can't
tape.
do that already.
Yeah, and the fun thing was back at the lab was our cutting console also had like the line amps and also the EQ. So there are times when the mastering happens on the fly
Awesome.
when we're cutting straight from the tape machine. So many times it's two or three people on board
Oh
when
yeah.
so we master with our completely fully analog chain in the main room, but we have the same equalizer in the cutting room.
Oh, okay.
So once, for example, Doug, my mentor back then, once he's set his mastering cue for each song,
Yeah.
we have like a few seconds before
Yeah.
each song to like recall the settings.
Run across.
So there's a lot of like
Hit the
choreography that happens. So
Yeah.
that was so fun. It's like it just makes the whole vinyl cutting process so much more organic.
Totally.
And when it's a fully analog session, you just know it's gonna sing on the vinyl format.
Yeah.
And you have to take into account the use of analog de-essers. So we had the Orban and the Maselect. Both were amazing. So in a way, that was the thing that I really loved about cutting completely analog. And at the bakery, we're not able to cut analog anymore just because, as I mentioned a while ago, there's a lot of things about our cutting lathe that works
It's automated
alongside.
now?
Yeah, like just MIDI triggers that
Right.
make a lot of things computer controlled, so we can
like
focus
bringing
on
your
a
head
lot.
back and stuff.
Yeah, and also like the echo and the band and the lockout groove.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more focus on the actual sonics. So even though we don't cut analog anymore, it's still something that I really enjoy doing. And I believe Maggie at Welcome to 1979 can cut straight from the tape machine too, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think Nick Townsend too.
Yeah, and the thing is when we cut at half speed,
Jeff Powell, I think.
Yeah, Jeff
Yeah,
does totally.
yeah. So there's a lot of vinyl cutters that can cut
I
straight
think
from tape.
Kevin Gray does too. I think Scott Hull has the
Yeah,
ability
Scott
to
Hull.
do that too.
So
I mean, all those G's.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
Scott,
So-
Stefan Marsh, Mastered by Marsh.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
There's so many.
So
There's so many secret geniuses out there that I want to give all the love to because those are all my homies.
Jeff
we see them a lot at the vinyl. What's our annual vinyl
Making
Making
vinyl.
conference? Yes, making vinyl.
Making vinyl.
Yeah, we see them
RIP.
every year.
Yeah.
Well, not this year.
Well, we did. I did.
Robin did.
I did. I was there.
That was fun.
I was in the chat.
But yeah, so even though the bakery we're fully digital, we're able to do so much just experimental stuff that works so great with contemporary music.
Yeah.
That's why we're able to work on a lot of just modern genres, rock, hip hop, electronic. That's what I find fun and special about our lathe. Eric likes to call it robo lathe.
I dig that.
And we still innovate on our lathe to this day. It helps that Eric has an electrical engineering degree, and
I feel like you have to, and that's like one of the things about
exactly.
being a cutter. I mean, especially
it saves,
with you guys.
It saves money when one of you guys is an electrical engineer.
I mean, or a mechanical engineer, or like
Yeah.
does some sort of fab stuff, because these machines have not changed, and there's been no
Yeah.
new iteration of them since sometimes the 50s, sometimes the 60s, depending on what model you have. I think like literally before the phono cut, my lathe was like the newest one on the block. I mean, Surrey made it in 2008, I think. So
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like a new version, but it's still
Definitely
on
one of the younger
old
ones.
principles. Yeah, but still the same kind of principles, right? So
And I remember you sent me a PDF of like something about the horns on yeah, that was like really cool because there's still a lot of discussion even with old technology.
constantly.
And yeah, there's still a lot of evolution, and even with a lot of R&D still happens in the vinyl world, which is great that we have the Making Vinyl conference, so we still get up to date on what is happening with physical formats out there.
It's one of the reasons that I can't leave Facebook, that vinyl cutting
I
engineer
know.
worldwide. I'm
That's
just like,
fun,
this is
yeah.
nerdy and I am here for, I don't even know what words you just said, but I'm going to
Yeah.
totally read about them. Yeah, it's the best. We've got a couple of questions from the
hope you're still talking.
Instagrams. We'll ask them like really quick. How about this? Why does a one-track side have so much dead wax when it could have been cut louder or at 45. I mean,
So
in my opinion, that's like sometimes just a client choice. What do you have to say about that, Jen?
it is a client choice many times too, especially as vinyl cutters. We often wonder, why didn't these people just go for 45? Because their music's gonna sound like it's gonna sing at 45. There are times when I'm sure like the actual musicians and labels will have their own
Reason.
answer to this. But
Totally.
I spoke with my client recently, and they're part of a record label, and many times they make this decision because their demographic audience, they're not necessarily like the audiophiles who would like read the jackets and say play at 45.
Right.
And many of these people don't realize that they're listening to a 45 record at 33. So removing that variable just ensures that listeners actually listen to their music accurately. And at the same time, like some people choose 33 over 45 because there are times when the idea of like switching from one side to the next all the time after like 10 minutes is kind of taxing and takes away from the whole music listening experience. So it's very much program dependent too. Like
Yeah, I mean, that's if you guys want to go back to Vinyl 101.1, we talk about the genesis of why a 45 actually came to be and why a 33 exists. And so they didn't actually used to have two speeds because you used to have two different turntables in order to achieve those things. So it's a luxury of being in the 20th and 21st centuries that you can switch your turntable speed with a button or by moving an elastic. I mean, depending on what kind of turntable you have. Ha ha.
Forced Exposure.
Great answer.
Shout out to Forced Exposure.
Yeah.
Great distro. Mail order. They asked about the availability of lacquers post-fire, which we sort of talked about earlier.
Oh, yes. And Eden Allison asked that question about the one-track side. And I don't know, Vinny77 is asking about the math that results in inner groove distortion, those things that make the format imperfect. I mean, I'm no mathematician, but the physics problem
at the
is,
end of the day,
is the RIAA curve for you, so that math is kind of done for you, and I just kind of earball it. So.
And also, if you're talking about numbers, we talked about it earlier, why music on the innermost part of the disc kind of loses quality. I'm not sure if we're able to cover it too much, but there's a reason why we recommend cutting music at around, the length of the music would be around 20 minutes and preferably not longer.
And your quiet songs towards the end of the side.
Yeah, because if you go farther in, the whole nature of the format is that the highs are going to be brittle on the innermost band. And if you're asking about the math, I wrote an article on Isotope. If you Google an Isotope vinyl mastering, that article is going to come out.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll share it.
So the sound deterioration on the innermost grooves is caused by the smaller amount of real estate for music to be cut inside as opposed to the outer diameter. So if we're talking about the outermost groove on a 33 and a third RPM disc, music can be cut 20 inches per second. So there's 20 inches of groove space for the music, so that there's much more definition and clarity on the top end. But if you're all the way at the inner side of your disc, there's only going to be 8.3 inches of groove space for 1 second of music.
Yeah.
So that's math.
And it's also the angle at which the numbers, and then it's also the angle at which the playback stylus sits too. So if you have even a slight skew on your Ortophone blue or your Ortophone red or any of your other styli du jour, that's going to affect your playback too. So I mean,
and also if Jen and Robin are going to put this on the show notes, on the Isotope article that I wrote, I actually took photos of how your music looks when it's cut on the outer band versus the inner band. Awesome. So you will see how it looks visually on the groove. Why
how those grooves stack up.
Yeah, it's a really cool way to understand the reality of the format.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's gonna be quality loss at the innermost band, and you can't avoid it, but you can lessen the effects of it by, like what Robin was saying, have your more relaxed, less hard hitting music at the very end of your program per side.
Totally.
So as we start to sort of come to the end here, what is your, I guess that you can share, what's your favorite project you've worked on?
Favorite is like a very difficult term, because it could be a favorite because of many things, but for me, we really enjoyed, well, I personally enjoyed working on the Green Day Revolution Radio record, both mastering and vinyl cutting, because they were there for the whole
Oh.
session.
Wow.
Crazy.
They didn't just hang out and had their photo ops done, but they were there for the whole session. And it's funny because when we were mastering, so we have one main mastering room and one vinyl cutting room. And while many times me and Eric tag team, so when Eric is mastering and when the client is attending sessions, I cut the lacquer refs on the spot. But something about our cutting lathe, a lot of it has been engineered so that things are automated so that it's easy for us to do recalls. So there's a lot of details on our cutting lathe that is MIDI controlled. So a lot of things remain consistent. So in a way, it also makes it easier for any non-vinyl cutter, as long as we just show them how it's done, to cut their own records.
Which
So
would never fly on my machine. I'd be like,
exactly.
don't touch
But
that.
yeah, it's like there's a lot of things that have been automated, so we can concentrate on many other facets of the vinyl cutting.
That's cool.
It's on our bakery Instagram and Twitter. It's probably somewhere like deeper down on our feed now. Billy Joe Armstrong
Mhm.
did a video of himself cutting his own 7-inch of
Oh,
45
that rules.
RPM.
Nice.
And
love that.
he even said, "We're here at the bakery," and
Oh,
he
yeah.
he cut his own record. And that was the fun part, because while Eric was mastering the main room, I was just hanging out with 3 of the Green Day band members as they watched me cut their vinyl refs.
And you were like, welcome
yeah.
to my world, fellas.
Yeah. So that was fun.
Boss
That's
ladies
definitely
in
one
the
of my
house.
favorite experiences of vinyl cutting. I mean,
That's
there's
awesome.
a lot, but yeah, that's a highlight.
One last thing before we go. We lost a titan in the mastering world just yesterday. And so I'd like to say a little moment of recognition for Al Schmidt and the incredible things that he gave to music and mastering in general. So we'll
That
put
that
up a little
really-
note about Al as well in our show notes so that everybody can go and appreciate his life's work.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Al. Just he passed away 2 days ago, and
Yeah.
and strangely enough, he passed away on the day of Doug Sax's birthday.
Ooh, legends
yeah,
on
and-
legends.
Yeah, I had the honor of having worked with Al, just because Al Schmidt always had Doug master his works.
Yeah.
So it was always fun seeing the synergy between them. And what I said earlier on Facebook, it like heaven just has greater sounding records now that they have Doug and Al.
It's true.
And just amazing and grateful we lived the time that they made their mark in the music industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they left it in good hands with you, though, Jett. You are can't
With-
say
with
enough.
Robin, with Jen, music is in good hands for the
Totally.
next generation.
Heck yeah. Thank you, Jett. That was amazing.
Yes. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks again for joining us for the Women in Vinyl podcast, part 2 of our dynamic episode with Jett Galindo from the bakery in Los Angeles. Thank you also to Witch Prophet for the use of her brand new song, Leilani. You can find this on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, Bandcamp, and everywhere exceptional music can be found. This podcast was produced by Women in Vinyl, proudly. The Women in Vinyl store is live now too at www.womeninvinyl.com/store. As always, join our conversation on Instagram or send us a note at media@womeninvinyl.com. Check out womeninvinyl.com for past episodes and all the amazing archives of interviews. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a review on your favorite podcast delivery method. You can also contribute to furthering our mission at patreon.com/womeninvinyl, where you'll find all of the B-sides, the deep cuts, and the amazing extras, and help us start a not-for-profit to further the demystification, education, and infiltration of more women and non-binary identifying humans into the vinyl making space. As always, thanks so much. Keep it analog.
This episode has been brought to you by Women in Vinyl and Red Spade Records. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe, and you can always contact us directly by visiting www.womeninvinyl.com.